evening to you, lovely learners out there. I'm excited to be here once again, and I'm very sure you've been waiting for another session on biology. This evening, we are talking about the skeletal system. Have you fractured an ankle before? Have you had a broken arm before? How do you feel when you sit in a particular position for a very long time? You can begin to complain about the backbone. What are we talking about? It is about the skeleton. And I want us to look at the two parts of the mammalian skeleton. We are talking about what we call the axial and the appendicular skeletons. The axial and the appendicular skeleton. So we are going to look at what the axial skeleton is, and then we shall look at what the appendicular skeleton is about. That will obviously be looking at the general plan of the mammalian skeleton. I expect that all of us will be able to describe the plan very well, and then you should be able to state the parts of the axial skeleton as well as the appendicular skeleton. Now, students have difficulty identifying these bones, and there are features that are peculiar, and each and every one should be able to pinpoint these peculiar features, and then having done that, the name of that bone must also come out. It's important because you could be given a specimen that has a particular appearance and you ought to identify that bone. I know for some of us, the closest we have come to the bone is when we have fried rice and chicken, or when we have chicken soup or something of that sort. Tonight, let us recall the shapes. Let us recall the appearance of the bones that we have been chewing. And when we are done with this session, tomorrow morning, just pick one plate and order that chicken part and begin to examine, this time not as a hungry person, but as somebody who is ready to have a practical session with the skeleton. Beautiful. Now, what do we say when we talk about the functions of the skeleton? We have what we call the endoskeleton and then the exoskeleton. In looking at what the mammalian system is made up of, we are talking about the endoskeleton. If you recall our sessions on arthropods and stuff like that, we spoke about the exoskeleton. And just to make reference to what we call the hydrostatic skeleton, for organisms that do not have very hard parts, either endo or exo, they have water in their body systems that allows them to be able to move. We're talking about the earthworms and stuff like that. So if we come to consider the endoskeleton and we are looking at the mammalian setup, we are talking about bones and cartilage. Bones and cartilage. What's the name of the bone or the bones that extend from the elbow to the wrist? What kind of bone do we have on the forehead? They are coming up pretty soon. Now, the skeleton forms a framework that supports the body. So we have a framework that supports the body. The skeletal system also offers protection. If we consider vital organs such as the brain, the heart, and the lungs, the brain is found in the skull, and so the skull or the cranium becomes the bone that protects the brain. Then we can look at the heart and the lungs that are found in the thoracic cavity. The heart and the lungs, they are found in the thoracic cavity, and so you have the ribs as well as the vertebral column, the sternum, protecting these parts. So when we say that the skeletal system offers protection, that is what we mean. Then let's look at movements. Movements. We have sites for muscle attachments, and then we also say that it makes movement possible. Sites for muscle attachment and the fact that it makes movement possible. Now note that muscles can only contract. Muscles can only contract. they cannot relax. And so once a muscle contracts, it is for another muscle to contract so that it will bring the first to contract into a relaxed position. Now, we call this antagonistic pairs. So muscles work in pairs, especially skeletal muscles. So if I consider the biceps on the side, okay, and I begin to flex the arm this way, the biceps here are contracting, all right? Then there's going to be the triceps on the side in the relaxed position. So for the bicep to go back to the relaxed position, the triceps must contract. So once this one contracts, the other relaxes. If this one contracts, then this one relaxes. That is to say that the two are working in opposite manner. That's what you call antagonistic pairs. That is what brings about movement. And if you recall the discussion on respiration, we talked about internal intercostal muscles and then external intercostal muscles, an example of antagonism. Good. The muscles or the bones, I beg your pardon, will also serve as storage sites. Calcium and phosphorus are very important elements, and they come and they are stored within the bones. So you have phosphates and calcium. That's why it's important that you're able to chew some bones, you're able to take in some of these seafoods because they contain a lot of calcium, and that is what will add to the storage in your bones. And when muscle action or nervous actions need some of these elements, they just draw from the bone. That is homeostasis. The last bit I want to mention is the production of blood cells. And you look at the sternum, the pelvis, and long bones. These areas serve as sites for production of blood cells. That was also discussed during the discussion on circulation. For those of you who have been on the Wolo app, downloaded it, and are going through the lessons, we've come across these things before. Back to what we started with, the endoskeleton. The skeleton is made of about 206 individual bones. 206. And we have what we call the axial and the appendicular. The axial gives us the axis, the central axis of the human body, starting from the skull to the vertebral column right through the base of what we call the coccyx, and that gives us the axial, the axis. So if I should stand this way, open my legs and stretch out my arms, okay, the part from the skull right through the midsection just to the base of the waist, within where the vertebral column ends, is what we term the axial skeleton. Then we have attachments, what we call appendages. That gives us the appendicular skeleton. So the arms are appendages, and then the limbs are also appendages. That is to say that they are attached to the axial. That gives us the axial and appendicular skeletons. So the 206 individual bones are distributed in this manner. 80 bones are found in the axial skeleton, and then 126 bones are found in the appendicular skeleton. And I'm sure you are wondering whether we're going to be studying 80 bones and 126 bones. Don't worry about that one. They are packaged in such a way that by the time we go through the parts of the body, we would have touched on these bones in a manner you least expected. And so don't get worried about the numbers we're churning out. The axial skeleton consists of the skull, as I said, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. The skull itself has about 14 cranial bones, the bones that make up the skull. And if you have looked at people's head all around, you notice that some have interesting extensions at the back, on the side. Some would have some valley-like features above and stuff like that. Now, those are the features that God endowed all of us with by turning the bones in a manner that would allow your brain to sit comfortably comfortably in your head. And so if you find a particular head shape, just look at that head shape and then identify the bones that you consider very prominent. We shall name the bones pretty soon. The appendicular skeleton also has what you call the pectoral and the pelvic girdles. The pectoral and the pelvic girdles. These are the parts that connect the limbs to the axial. And so with my arms stretched out, you will notice that there's a bone at the back that supports the arm. And then with my legs, they have also been fitted into the body at the waist region. That's where we have the pelvic bone. The pelvic bone. So the appendicular skeleton is made up of the girdles, the pectoral, and then the pelvic. And then of course the limbs, the fore and the hind limbs. Let's take a look at our good friend here. We can call him Joe. And you notice that Joe's presentation here looks at the axial from this point right through to this end, all down to this part, and it comes back this way and it goes back to the top. Now what I have taken out is the axial skeleton. I said the axial is made up of the skull, and you've seen the thoracic cage, and then you have seen the ribs over there. So you notice that there is a vertebral column as well. Now this is an anterior view. In biology, we would want to describe the views and positions using the appropriate term. So the anterior view is when you are taking a look at the frontage, and then we also have the posterior view. And so when you stand behind your friend, you have a posterior view of that fellow. And so what we have as B over here is a posterior view of Joe. So you can see the skull of Joe, a very beautiful one, I guess. Comes down through here, and then the rib cage right down to the waist, okay, and back there. So that gives us the axial skeleton. So we will take a look at the skull and then identify the bones over there. I mentioned 14 cranial bones and 8 facial bones. We'll name only a few. We'll name only a few. I am not turning you into a bone specialist yet. We are just going to the fundamentals and the basics, so that when there is a need to add to that, we can do that conveniently. Very well. So here we have the skull, which is part of the axial skeleton. Let us take a look at the front view first. There's what you call the frontal bone, which forms the forehead. So if you notice that someone has a very prominent forehead, don't come tell us that the guy has a big head. Now the guy will feel insulted. But as a biologist, tell the person that you admire the prominence of the frontal bone, and you will notice that you are an astute biologist describing the features of an organism you have encountered. Congratulations. Now at the back side, we have what we call the parietal bone. The parietal bone. And you notice that these bones have a joint at this point. Now this type of joints are called sutures. Sutures. S-U-T-U-R-E. Sutures. So these are joints that are formed. They are not movable joints, but because the skull is made up of a number of parts, they come together and they conveniently give us the head shape that we so much admire. Some people will prefer to have a lot of hair on it. Others will want to put a wig or something on it. But that is your choice. That is your choice. Very well. We can talk about the temporal bone over here. That is where you have your ear, okay, That's the temporal bone. So note that the temporal bones are two, one on the left and one on the right. The frontal bone, one. The parietal bones, two. Then we have the occipital bone. The occipital bone. This is the occipital bone. What is at the back side? And it could be very prominent for some people. If a certain parts of the continent come with a very prominent feature, that is the occipital bone. And you realize that it is not something that is out of the ordinary. It is what we all have. These parts may be prominent in some people and may not be prominent in others. So in talking about the skull, we can identify the cranial bones. Now, if you have read a little bit about the nervous system, more precisely the brain, you notice that certain parts of the brain are named according to the bones that cover them. So we can talk about the parietal region, the frontal, etc. So that is for the skull. Get to know these bones and you are in good business. We can also identify the mandible, and you know the mandible, especially with the cockroach and stuff like that. But we also have the mandible. And then we can talk about the maxilla, the zygomatic bone, that's the nasal bone. So these are examples of the bones that you have within the skull. So we are looking at the axial skeleton, what forms the central axis from the top to the waist region, and that gives us the skull. So we have mentioned the frontal bone, we have mentioned parietal bones that extend to the sides and contribute to the face. We have mentioned the temporal bone. I did show that to you. Then at the rear of the skull is the occipital bone. Now we are using words to describe the position. So if we say that on top of the cranium is the frontal bone, and you say that at the back or the rear is the occipital bone, then we are using the terminologies so that anybody listening to us will know where we are referring to: the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, mandible, maxillary, zygomatic, etc. I'm not speaking in tongues. We're talking about the skeletal system. So at the base of the skull, we have the spinal cord. Now, that spinal cord passes through what you call the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum. That is the opening through which the spinal cord passes into the skull. So the skull forms that cavity that the brain is contained in there. So much for the skull. Now let's consider the vertebral column. Let's consider the vertebral column. The vertebral column supports the head and trunk, and then they protect the spinal cord as well. So one of the features of the vertebral column is that it protects the spinal cord, a very, very important organ in the mammalian system. And they are the roots of spinal nerves that will run in there. Now, what is important for us at this point is to identify the kind of bones we have in the vertebral column. And so what we have up here, okay, within the neck region, this brown area is what you call the cervical vertebrae. Now there are 7 of them. 7 of them. So if you look at where the neck starts from and where it ends, just above the thoracic region, you notice that we have what we call the cervical vertebrae. Now each of these will have a certain feature. We shall look at that in due course. Next to that is what we call the thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 of them. Thoracic, there are 12 of them. So cervical 7, thoracic 12. Then we have the lumbar. The lumbar, that is 5 of them. So 7 plus 12, that gives us 19, plus 5, that gives us 24. Now, we have 5 bones that are fused to form one bone, what you call the sacrum, and then 4 other bones fused to give us the coccyx. 4 other bones to give us the coccyx. Now, in some organisms, especially the ones with a tail, the coccyx actually makes up the tail bones. So they are not fused, but they can be extended. So we also have a tail, but that tail is internal, just with the bones. It does not extend what you call the post-anal tail. So the goat, the monkey, they have a post-anal tail beyond the anus, post-anal tail. But the tailbone is actually found at the base of the vertebral column. That gives us 26 bones. In the case of humans, take note, in the case of humans, if you read somewhere that we have more than 26, then probably you are looking at an organism that is not having these bones fused, and therefore some will go as far as 33. Very good. Now, the vertebral column has what you call 4 curvatures. 4 curvatures. And I'm sure you have seen somebody with a hunchback before. The hunchback. Now, the hunchback is as a result of an abnormal curvature which is found at a certain portion of the vertebral column. The 4 normal curvatures are the cervical curvature, which is what we expect in the neck region, and then we have the thoracic curvature, the lumbar curvature, and then the pelvic curvature. Now, these positions will not put stress on any part of the body. So when you sit and you keep these positions as their normal curvatures, there's no problem. Now, if you bend for a long time, putting stress on other parts in ways that are not ordinary, then you begin to have pains in the backbone. And so it's important that you examine the seat you use, especially for those of us who sit for long hours, and know that it has an effect on the backbone. So this is the normal way we expect to have it. Now, if you take a look at the sideways view, we have what you call a scoliosis. That's an abnormal lateral curvature. For this normal person, we are looking at the lateral side view. So it's as if you are standing by the right of the person and you're looking at the person right from the ear through the shoulders. Now for scoliosis, we are taking an anterior view. Sorry, a posterior view. We are at the back of the person and we are looking at the person with the vertebral column. Instead of coming down vertically, there seems to be a curvature on this side. That is scoliosis. Then we can talk about kyphosis, which is what we call a hunchback. You can see that there is an extension in the curvature within the thoracic region. There's a hunchback because of the way the bones are extending out of their normal thoracic curvature. We have a situation which is an abnormality. The last one I want to talk about is lordosis, which is an abnormal curvature in the lumbar region. So people have these kinds of curvatures, and for some of them there have been attempts to correct them surgically, and some have succeeded and others have challenges with theirs. It's important that if you notice an abnormal curvature, you consult the doctor and let him or her address the situation from the expert point of view. So as we said, we have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 fused sacral bones, which forms a single bone called the sacrum. The sacral bones are 5 and they are fused to form the sacrum. And then we have the coccyx, In some situations, we call them the caudal vertebra. That is what forms the tailbone. Now, to prevent these bones from physically rubbing one another, we have what you call the intervertebral disc. The intervertebral disc. Now, this disc is composed of what you call fibrocartilage. Now, it allows one vertebra to sit on another without physically rubbing that one, and so you don't have the pains that you will experience if these cartilages are worn out. And it allows us to have a very smooth bending, arching positions. Prevent the vertebra from grinding against one another. It serves as shock absorbers as well. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about. So we have one bone here, the next over here, and then in between the two we have the intervertebral disc. Inter meaning between, so between the vertebra there is a disc. Between the vertebra there's a disc. That's what's called the intervertebral disc. It is made up of fibrocartilage. It is going to cushion and serve as a spine's shock absorbing system. These are important features of the body, and we ought to take good care of them. Then again, there are ligaments that extend along the length of the vertebral column, and it is going to contribute to the overall stability. It is going to contribute to overall stability. Now, these bones are fitted or articulated together in a manner that allows flexibility. So, if you want to exercise, you can begin to bend them gradually. Now, don't compare yourself to that Olympic acrobat who turns around and rolls 7 times and lands. If you are tempted the first time, we may not share your experience because you will sing a new song, Nearer My God to Thee. Your bones may be hardened because of lack of exercise. And so when you want to start something like that, just consult somebody who is a physical instructor to teach you what to do. Because if you fracture one, I tell you, you are in big trouble. It will take some time to heal. But then you have to put yourself in an immobilized position. That introduces a lot of discomfort. I wish you well. Ladies and gentlemen, I want us to look at what you call the generalized vertebra. The 26 or 33 in some cases bones that we have in the vertebral column come with features. This is where I will want you to pay particular attention with the practical orientation, because we can be given a cervical vertebra, we can be given a thoracic vertebra, or the lumbar vertebra. The next time you are fortunate to land a big chicken, don't order for the thigh. Go for the ribs and the backbone for academic purposes. I know it is difficult to massage that area, but for the purposes of your biology practical paper, go for that part and let's examine it. Let's get to the lab. The vertebrae are built on what you call the same basic plan. There's what you call the centrum. This area here is referred to as the centrum. So when you draw and label that the centrum, you have a point for that label. And the function is that it is going to support and protect the cord. This is where another vertebra will sit for us to have the extension. Then we have the neural arc, the spine. This region we have here is giving us the arc. This is the neural spine. Take note. Then we have transverse processes. Now, when we're talking about bones and you see processes, we're only talking about extensions. So we talk about the olecranon process, the odontoid process, the transverse process. These are all extensions. So we have an extension here, and we expect that the rib the rib will fit here, and then another one here. So this is what we end up having in the event that we have the ribs. That is what will give us the rib cage. Okay, then there's a neural canal. The neural canal being the passage for the spinal cord. What you are labeling here as a vertebral foramen. Vertebral foramen. The word foramen in this discussion will talk about passages, cavities, or holes for other structures to move through. So we'll talk about the obturator foramen when we talk about the pelvic girdle. In this case, we are talking about the neural canal. This is where the spinal cord passes, this space over here. Then we have the anterior and posterior facets, also referred to as the Ziegler apophysis. And I know students are not happy with such big terms, but we must know them. The Ziegler apophysis. They articulate with other parts. For instance, the ribs. So these facets over here are going to articulate with the ribs. When we use the word articulate, we're talking about joints. Joint. You've been talking about the articulated tract. Articulator. Because there's a head, okay, that is joined to a tail. That's the articulation. And so when we talk of articulate, we are talking about joining. And so we're saying that one part of the body articulates with another part of the body. We are talking about the skeletal system. So having said something about the generalized vertebra, let's note that the cervical is relatively flat with short neural spine. So that is a pointer. When you notice two of these bones, if it has a very short neural spine, then it's a cervical vertebra. If it's relatively flat, then it's a cervical vertebra. Because I can ask you to identify with reasons. Identify with reasons. There are some friends, you can identify them by their voices. You can identify some by their head shape, some by their height, etc. Because you are familiar with their characteristics. In the same vein, you ought to familiarize yourself with the characteristics of these bones. So when you say that this person is this guy, it is because of his height, his name, the way he speaks, where he sits, etc. So why do you say this bone is a cervical bone? It's because it has a short neural spine, it's relatively flat. Then you are giving us reasons for your identification. That is what the biology practical is all about. Beautiful. So the thoracic has a long neural spine. So a short neural spine for cervical, a long neural spine for the thoracic. The sacral vertebrae is fused in the case of humans, forming the sacrum, as I said. And then we have the coccyx, also consisting of 4 small fused bones. Now take a look at the cervical vertebrae. I said there are 7 of them. The 7 of them. Good. Of course, they are housing the spinal cord, and they send message because they are directly linked to the brain. So if somebody should twist your neck very well, he will end up dislocating the cervical vertebra from its position, disturbing the spinal cord, and then you lose the ability to send message to the brain, and therefore you are off entirely. It allows the neck to move in all directions. Take note. It facilitates the flow of blood to the brain, and it connects the skull. These are the functions of the cervical vertebrae. But more importantly, I want us to look at the feature. The first cervical vertebrae is referred to as the atlas. That's a C1. So in the vertebral column, we have the cervical numbered C1 to C7. So when I say C1, I'm talking about the first cervical vertebra, and it's called the atlas. That's what you see here, atlas. The second is called the axis. That's C2. The alphabet T comes before X. So atlas is first and axis is second. Take note of that. Now, this is where you have a feature that allows the skull to sit. So the kind of interaction that the atlas will have for the skull or with the skull is not the same as what C2 to C7 will have. And so it puts the atlas in a peculiar position, giving it peculiar features. Then C2, which is the axis, has what we call the dens, or the more popular term is the odontoid process. Odontoid process. The odontoid process gives us an extension or a protrusion that allows the skull to sit comfortably on it. So the odontoid would be put through this passage here for the skull to sit on it. That is how the axis and the atlas interact. That's how the axis and the atlas interact. Then when we come to look at C3 to C7, this is how it will look like. So we can talk of the transverse processes. I mentioned them. We can talk of the transverse foramen, what would allow passages. We have vertebral canals. Now, the cervical vertebra is the one that will have these canals. So if you examine them closely, you see three holes. One being the neural canal, and then these ones being what you call the vertebral canals. They are vertebra, arteries, and canals. So vertebral canals, canals that are meant for arteries to pass through. So we have a centrum over here. Unlike the atlas and the axis, where we did not really see the centrum, C3 to C7 will have a centrum. So we can also say that the centrum of the atlas is not present. However, the centrum of the axis is modified into the odontoid process, which allows the skull to sit on it. That is for the cervical vertebra. Take note of the vertebral canals, its flattened nature, as well as the axis and the atlas in terms of structure. Let's go and look at the thoracic vertebrae. So we are talking about T1 to T12. These ones are characterized by long neural spines. Long neural spine. If you have seen that of, let's say, the cow, it is actually long, and you can even hold it with your fists. That's a long neural spine. If you examine that of the fish, next time you come across the tilapia, take your time, get the flesh off. When you eat and you are satisfied, you throw the bones away. So before you begin to eat, just get the flesh off on one side and then examine the bones from the skull to the tail with the banku resting by the side. You can concentrate on that, and when you have done a good job academically digesting the knowledge, then you can digest the carbohydrate and the protein as well. Here we have a neural canal effectively positioned at the center. That is where you have the spinal cord. Then again, we have a centrum. In the case of the thoracic vertebra, take note that we have a large intervertebral foramen. That's a neural canal. And then we have a long neural spine. And then we also have processes that allows the ribs to make articulations. Processes or extensions that allows the ribs to make articulations. I'm going to ask you to compare two of these, the cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar. And when I get there, I will expect those of our numbers will call us to give us a good description of these parts. The last part I want to look at within the vertebral column is the lumbar vertebra. The lumbar vertebra also has a centrum, and this one is relatively thicker, because if you take a look at the region around the abdomen, this is the only bone that will support the upper part of the body. And so if you decide to carry a bag of cement on your head, all that weight is directed through the centrum over here. That is why we say that the lumbar has a very large and prominent centrum, because it needs to be able to contain the pressure. Pressure is force over area. If the area is big enough, then the force is distributed and it reduces the pressure. If the area is very small, the pressure is quite high. So we can see the neural spine over here, neural canal over here. What I would say is that when you look at the lumbar, notice that it has a large prominent centrum. So in talking about the vertebral column, we can say that they range in sizes from the smallest cervical to the lumbar, which is the largest. The upper body weight is distributed through the spine to the sacrum and the pelvis. So even though we are not taking an extensive look at what we have in the sacrum and the coccyx, note that those are the parts that make contact with the pelvic bones. And so they provide the support, and then they allow the force directed through the vertebral column to be distributed into the limbs. So the contact with this pelvic girdle is what allows the force, which is within the vertebral column, to be effectively distributed within the body. So the natural curves in the spine, the kyphotic and the lordotic curves, provide resistance and elasticity in distributing body weight and axial loads sustained during movement. Now you notice that the pregnant woman may not walk with the body upright, especially those that are very advanced in the gestation period. Some of them will prefer to arch the body a bit and then support the waist with the palm. That is because there is an extension in the abdominal region, and some force is directed out of the vertebral column, and so the center of gravity would shift. That is why it's important that the body is taken in that arched position to draw the center of gravity back into the sacrum, and then it distributes into the limbs. That is the architecture of the vertebral column, and that is how movement is supported by the skeletal system. Now, the sacrum, as I said, is a triangular shaped bone. It also has the S1 to S5, but they are fused to give us the sacrum. They are fused to give us the sacrum, and it is fitted between two hip bones connecting the spine to the pelvis. So the last vertebra of the lumbar region will sit on the first bone in that sacrum connection. That is what is going to give the transmission of the force down through the vertebral column and to the other side. I believe we have had an in-depth knowledge on the structure of the vertebral column. Here I give you a pictorial view of the sacrum and the coccyx. The coccyx being what we have down here, and then the sacrum being what we have over there, for the purposes of attachment with the pelvic girdle. We shall look at that pretty soon. Before I take a break, let me also take a look at the axial rib cage, where we have these bones. In the rib cage, we have what you call the thoracic vertebrae, which is the thoracic vertebrae, which are the bones within the vertebral column in the thoracic region. Then you have the ribs, the costal cartilages, and then the sternum, or what is popularly called the breastbone. In the rib cage, I want you to know that we have 12 pairs of ribs. 7 of them are referred to as the true ribs, mainly because they make an attachment with the sternum. This is rib number 1, number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, these ones here make an attachment with the sternum directly. Then, 5 of the 12 are referred to as false ribs. For the false ribs, 3 of them will have an extension 8, 9, and 10 reaching to the cartilage on the 7th rib. So 5 of them are called false ribs because they are not directly attached to the sternum. 3 of them, 8, 9, and 10, will make an extension to attach to the 7th rib cartilage. Then we have the 11th and 12th, the last 2 down there, what we refer to as the floating ribs. The floating ribs. That gives us where the vertebral column and the rib cage would end with the axial skeleton. Let's take a very important break, and then when I come back, I'll add the appendicular bit, and then we have that as a whole. Then we can wait for our callers to find out if they are understanding what we are discussing. We are enjoying Wulu, the smart way to learn. I'll be back.